Good morning. My name is Sandy Wolfwood, and I'm a member of Westminster's Social Justice Ministry team here. We build the social justice forums around a common theme, and this program year, our theme is diving deeper together so all will flourish. This theme builds on our heightened awareness of the systemic and critical issues affecting our community, brought to greater attention in recent years, most especially in response to the murder of George Floyd. Through the forums, we will learn about long-standing needs and become more prepared to support the flourishing of all members of our community. Today, we welcome Kath Hammerseng of Edina Realty. Kath is speaking on behalf of the Just Deeds Project, an effort to help homeowners remove discriminatory language from property titles and educate all of us about the systemic racism that led to segregated housing covenants that prevented people of color from buying houses in certain areas of the Twin Cities and building wealth over the last 100 years. We began looking at this issue, many of you may remember, with a forum a couple of years ago by filmmaker Dan Bergen, speaking about his film, Jim Crow of the North, and the Mapping Prejudice project. Today, Kath will give us some background on this work, on the legal aspects of racial covenants, the discharge process, and how covenants have played a role in real estate. In addition to Kath Hammerseng's volunteer work with Just Deeds, she has a list of extensive community involvement on her bio, which was fun to read. And one particular thing caught my eye, which I mentioned to her, and that was the fact that she's retired now, but she has 20 years plus as a West Metro firefighter. And she just told me that she was just elected Realtor of the Year, and she will go to a national convention and talk a little bit more about what she's going to talk about today. So when I turn it over to all of you for questions after Kath is done speaking, for those attending in person here in the Meisel room, raise your hand and I'll bring a microphone so everybody can hear your question. And for those attending on live stream, please submit your comment or question in the live stream chat, and we'll monitor that and raise your question or comment with our speaker. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kath. Welcome, Kath. So thanks so much for coming.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks for having me. It is a pleasure. And as you mentioned, I come from the real estate world, and that kind of was my foray into this work. I happen to be, timing-wise, the president of the Minneapolis Area Association of Realtors during the time when Mapping Prejudice was really ramping up and starting to do their work in Hennepin County. And in that role was allowed to choose some initiatives. So one of my major initiatives there was the Mapping Prejudice Project, supporting them and bringing that knowledge and understanding to the real estate community, because while back in the 40s and 50s and even earlier, the real estate community participated in what created redlining and the problems associated. Most realtors have no idea either. They're just out doing their day-to-day work, and so bringing that forward is a privilege, and it's important work that people understand the progression of things, and then our role in actually making that better or improving on that. So from that year of helping rally realtors to actually be part of the army that was evaluating all these deeds in Hennepin County, to then I'm with Edina Realty, so our diversity, equity, and inclusion team really began to focus more on these issues and what can we do about those, so I'm involved there. And then ultimately from that, information sprung the Just Deeds Project. And the Just Deeds Project is kind of we have all this information, what do we do now? What do we do about that now? And so Just Deeds is about action, where previously a lot of the work had been about information. And we're about information too, because the action is really coming out and speaking to folks to help them understand the issue, and then helping them get to the next step of if you do have a property, what do we do about it? So our mission is to just acknowledge the racist practices that existed for centuries in our country, but really in the last century is when this really took place and was perpetuated through segregating housing. Also to understand who benefits from racial covenants. Why did they happen in the first place? Why does their legacy still shape how we live today? And why are people still benefiting from that, even though the covenants are no longer enforceable? And then how to discharge those covenants, how to find out if you have property that has a racial covenant on it, because most people who have those 10 years ago, I'll bet almost no one who had a racial covenant on their property was aware that actually it existed or what that meant. So what are discriminatory covenants? Let's just start at the very base. Back in the early 1900s, when housing was built, typically you would build your own home or contract with one or more people to build a single home on a lot that you procured. So houses were built one off, and people helped each other with that construction. During that time, our population in the Twin Cities was relatively diverse. People were spread out all over the place, and then came developers. The idea of development was, I'm going to buy a big piece of land, I'm going to develop it, plan it out, and then I'm going to build homes there and try to make money, right? And so one of the things these developers came up with to try to enhance the value of these properties was to make them exclusive. And I think we all know that the only way to find exclusivity is actually to create an other and to make yourself better, right? And so what these developers did was make these properties exclusive by adding covenants or restrictions to the deeds to the property. And essentially these covenants said, no persons of any race other than Caucasian race could occupy that property. Or they might specifically identify certain races, or in a few instances, faiths. And so it made the people who could purchase there somehow feel better than, and it somehow increased the value of these properties. And so these covenants were put on. They included all different sorts of races described in some very unsavory ways. And the one thing that stands out around this is they may have included the words Asian or Mongoloid or Jewish, but they always included Negro or Black or worse. They always included the African American community in these racial restrictions. What they say is, you can't live there, you can't rent to somebody, and you can't sell to somebody of those descript categories. And if you do so, the property, the ownership of the property reverts back to the developer or their heirs. So this could go on for generations. That's what the covenants are and what they say. And up until the Mapping Prejudice Project, they just sat there, unenforceable now, but they just sat there on these deeds and people didn't even know they existed. So this shows what happened once Mapping Prejudice took off. Different areas of the country with large centers of population began creating their own Mapping Prejudice projects. And what they found was there are inequality or racist covenants that exist in most of these communities that all kind of were built out around the same time. So you can see the different colors. What you might not be able to see is these different colors are describing areas that exist, and it kind of works out from the center of the city for a large part. But they are beginning with the very best, green, fabulous, and then a blue, still desirable. Yellow was definitely declining, and then red is actually considered hazardous. So in a community that was very colorful, those communities were considered hazardous. By who, you ask? By your federal government. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means. Whoop. Yeah, so this is a map, and you can see the years as they move forward of what happened with racial covenants and where they were created. And this is your community, so you know where these places are. You can see where the lakes are. You can see Lake Minnetonka out here, and you can see these areas that are expanding are showing where racial covenants were created over time as these communities developed. And of course, the most desirable locations were filled with racial covenants, right? Up on the top there, you can see Medicine Lake. Now here's a closer view. This is South Minneapolis. And you can see over time how these areas were developed out and racial covenants were added to create the exclusivity that gave the impression of value that equated to actual value over time. And so this is kind of what it looks like. The crazy thing about this is I think you probably might recognize that many of these areas are still incredibly affluent areas now. So the value that was created by this perception 100 years ago has continued to perpetuate the value of those properties, which are still largely occupied by people without color, let's say. So it kind of shows you how generationally this has carried on through time and allowed those properties and those people to benefit from the appreciation created there. Okay, I'm going to show a brief video. How many people here have seen Jim Crow of the North? Some have not. So I'm going to give you a snippet of that, so I apologize for the repetition for those of you who did not have that opportunity. This is a little more about redlining and what happened with the federal government once they figured this thing out.
And now, through the use of a National Housing Act insured mortgage, is brought within the reach of all citizens on a monthly payment.
In the midst of the New Deal, when the FDR administration is looking for ways to try to stabilize the housing market, the Fair Housing Act is passed in 1934. And as part of that, the Homeowners Loan Corporation is also established with the hope that if you could establish long-term mortgages with fixed interest rates, you could create pathways to homeownership for most Americans.
This time they can buy this house with monthly payments that are less than they now spend for rent.
When the FHA starts underwriting mortgages in the 1930s, this really is a game changer in a lot of ways. It takes a lot of risk off the banks, it places it onto the federal government, and now working class, middle class families, they're able to purchase a home.
Unfortunately, as part of that, what the HOLC does is it establishes designations for neighborhoods based on the occupants of those neighborhoods.
And this is where the term redlining comes into place. The FHA, they made color-coded maps of all the largest cities in the United States, and they broke cities down into 4 different areas. Red is considered hazardous, that's the worst. Yellow is considered definitely declining. Blue is considered still desirable, and green is considered the best.
And what's so powerful about this kind of scale of measuring investment, it was about values and people.
The fact of the matter is that there was no evidence that those people who lived in those communities, predominantly black and brown people and foreign-born people, would have defaulted on loans.
There are no firm realities behind the close proximity to blackness and your property values going down. That's just not true.
The FHA is being very upfront and very explicit in how they're linking spatial desirability with racial occupancy. It's this racialization of space idea. So areas that were predominantly African American or majority minority, or really in a lot of cases, even if there's a few non-white people there, that's often enough to be redlined. So when they built these maps, they also explained why each area got the ranking it did.
The area around 4th Avenue South, which is called the Old South Side. This was a nice area. It had nice homes. It's the historic African American neighborhood on the south side of Minneapolis.
This one part of South Minneapolis was redlined specifically due to, and I'm quoting, a gradual infiltration of Negroes and Asiatics. The FHA refused to give an area a green-lined designation. Again, this is the best designation that they'll offer unless, and I'm quoting again, restrictive covenants are already in place. That line's from the FHA underwriting manual. Racial covenants aren't just about discriminating against people of color. It's about enriching white people. And I think that's the part that often gets lost in this narrative. And I think it does speak to the ways that white supremacy have been embedded in really built structures and built environments. I mean, if your grandparents bought a home on Minnehaha Creek, that home's worth, what, $500,000? If your grandparents rented an area that was redlined and then subsequently destroyed by a freeway project, you're not inheriting anything.
In a lot of ways, the practice of redlining, which didn't start until the 1930s, institutionalized and spread racial covenants all over the country because suddenly developers got sanction, they got direction from the federal government saying, this is best practices if you want to have a really high rating from us, if you want to get the most favorable terms for any loans.
By kind of de-integrating Minneapolis, which in many ways is what racial covenants are doing, this set the stage and enabled all these subsequent systems of inequality to really take hold.
This very persistent myth that northern cities never had formal segregation. The South had Jim Crow, and look at those signs. Well, racial covenants did the work of Jim Crow in the North, all over the North.
Many whites simply were not aware that there was a segregation. So many people in Minneapolis would be outraged what they thought that their friend was being discriminated against. They knew something was happening, but it wasn't happening to your friend. That was what kind of this mixed kind of a situation that we had in Minneapolis. I mean, if you could imagine these people, their parents sent me cookies and, cakes all during the war. And I was welcome in their house. There was no question about it. And then there's other people who were just absolutely Klansmen. That was what Minneapolis was all about. But that was my generation in Minneapolis. We were hemmed in that ghetto, and that was our life. That was our world.
The 1935 land use planning map used to define which place would get mortgages versus others circled these areas, called them slums, places where the quote-unquote Negroes lived. These are places to avoid, right? So they're gonna give you substandard housing and they're gonna contain you. Access to affordable housing was a challenge. When you think about the reasons behind the creation of public housing, we had a lot of folks forced to the low-wage sector, right? And you're thinking about what jobs or opportunities that low-income folks of color even had access to at this time. I would argue that with the creation of public housing in 1938, with the Sumner Field homes, became this really interesting iteration of the redesign of space. You have 400 units of public housing, which were segregated at the time, created. In 1953, the City Council of Minneapolis refused to scatter another 1,000 units of public housing outside of the Sumner Field Homes area. And where did these pressures come from? You had both internal conservative politicians and outlying suburban communities coming in saying, not in my neighborhood. And the City Council crumbled under the pressure and then took what was 400 units of public housing to over 1,000 units in less than a decade. They have strategically manufactured urban poverty.
this history is very personal for me. I'm a third generation Minneapolitan. My grandparents were immigrants from Sweden who came to this country with nothing, worked incredibly hard jobs, but both sets of my grandparents in 1942 were able to buy houses in South Minneapolis. These houses were in a part of the city that was blanketed by racial covenants. Because of those racial covenants, my parents grew up in neighborhoods that were entirely white. And in many ways, they described them as a paradise for children. They had wonderful parks. They had really solid schools that sent them to college. But no one in their neighborhood ever talked about the fact that this neighborhood was only for white people. And I want everyone with this map to imagine themselves in this landscape of privilege and disenfranchisement.
So PBS in Minneapolis here, in St. Paul, has done a full-blown, this is a portion of Jim Crow of the North. If you want to know more, you can find it on the Just Deeds website and grab that link, and you can learn more about this. But as you can see, we went from a relatively integrated community to systematic segregation, starting with these racial covenants on the deeds. In the 30s, the federal government coming in and saying, we need to help more people own homes, and then saying, but we're gonna pick the least risk, the areas of least risk. It makes sense. It makes fiscal sense, right? We're gonna choose the areas of least risk. But because those areas were created by those racial covenants, now all of a sudden we're gonna offer loans in areas that only whites can purchase. So FHA loans, or the loans to help people get into home ownership, were created inadvertently, I'll say generously, for white people only. And so if you were a person of color and you lived in the communities where you were allowed to live, it was more difficult, if not impossible, for you to get a mortgage. So guess who bought those properties and then rented those to the people of color? So you see this wealth starting to build. Now let's pile on top of that the GI Bill. Everybody familiar with the GI Bill? Fabulous program, was created to help people who served our country. At the time, men who served our country, but of course that's carried on, purchase a home once you got out of the service. A great program. But again, because it's the GI Bill, it's a federally backed loan, you can only purchase properties with a GI Bill in an area that had racial covenants or was rated well, which meant that I think in the state of Alabama, there were 2 people of color who were allowed to use their GI Bill. It just didn't work. But we never said that out loud, right? The people who enjoyed the privilege didn't even recognize or realize, because they were doing the thing and felt that everybody was doing the thing. But that's not the case, right? So then we moved to people beginning to recognize it. I keep trying to touch the screen. Mm-hmm. They did not allow blacks access to the education. Thanks for sharing that. A lot of folks for not being able to go to school, right? So all of a sudden, this wealth gap is growing. So on the one hand, as they said in the video, we were denying people the right to, but on the other hand, we were creating a system that was enhancing the wealth of another group. So the gap continued to grow. Thanks for sharing that. All right, let's get myself, perfect. All right, so legal milestones. So in the 1940s, the NAACP started to recognize this and launched a legal campaign to get some exposure, right? That's how we start. We let people know that something's happening. 1948, the Supreme Court says that covenants are unenforceable, but that didn't change a whole lot about how people behaved. In 53, the Minnesota legislature, who I'm proud to say has been progressive all the way along where these issues are concerned. Prohibits the use of racial restrictions in real estate documents. And then in 68, of course, fair housing, and on we go. So the Minnesota homeownership gap still exists today, originating way back and carrying on through. So the blue line is people of color, the yellow line is white, and then the pink line is all of Minnesota. So you can see the majority, these are very close, the majority of homeowners in Minnesota are white. Just to give you an idea, about 74% of white Minnesotans own their homes. About 24% of black Minnesotans own their homes. So still quite a significant gap. We're one of the worst in the country, ironically. So interesting. So this talks a little bit about the other impacts, the other demographic impacts of these practices. So they divide our community by race, and that physical segregation, which is what you're looking at here, is pretty clear to see, right? So the most diverse are the dark green areas that you can see there on the map. And then the next, the lighter green, becomes a little bit more diverse, or the most diverse is the green areas, and then the least diverse are the red areas. And so you can see that graduated scale there. So around the lakes, the more desirable properties continue to be less diverse even today. So this is a 2015 map. The economic impacts are about wealth accumulation, right? If you live in an area where values aren't increasing as fast as they are in another area, you're going to see some disparity in your appreciation. And in 2008, when the real estate market crashed, you might have noticed that some areas really barely felt it. Edina barely felt it. And Edina's population prominently white to this day. So wealth accumulation, that generational wealth we talk about, where my grandparents owned a home, they passed a little on to their parents, or to their kids, who then passed it on to me. That didn't happen in those BIPOC communities. At the same time, the culture also didn't exist in those families. The culture of my family growing up was, you grow up, you get a job, you buy a house. But if you didn't grow up in a house where that was the culture, you didn't even think it was your reality, or you didn't even aspire to that, or know it was a possibility for you. So, lots of change that created all of this wealth disparity. In addition, the businesses that succeeded also existed more so in these more affluent areas, of course. So the idea of accumulation through business opportunities, wealth accumulation in that way. And then think about access to education. If the tax base is lower, what happens to the education, right? So now you're in an area where the education quality isn't quite as deep because the tax base is lower. What about healthcare? A prominent doctor who's trying to build a practice might not choose to put their practice in the middle of an area that doesn't have a lot of money. They're going to go for the affluent area so that they can build a practice there. So healthcare availability even is a disparity there is created. So all of these opportunities that people have in these predominantly white neighborhoods, again, we talk about privilege, and sometimes people are offended by that term, but people don't even know. Privilege is about not even being aware and knowing, because it was that way. That's how it was. And that's how people talked about it. It's just that way. I don't know why, but now we know why. So there we go. So health this is a map on health impacts by zip code. So you can see that piece. This is life expectancy, right? So the lightest color are the people who live the longest, 83 or more years. The darkest color there in the center is the people who live the shortest lives. So it actually impacts longevity of life. Infrastructure impact. You heard in the video a little bit about how we designed our roadways and our road systems, and a lot of you probably know about Rondo neighborhood. It's pretty well known that when we were deciding where to put highways, we looked at the neighborhoods, and lo and behold, that black neighborhood, even a thriving neighborhood like Rondo, seemed a better path than an affluent white neighborhood. And so even if people were able to establish a foothold, get some home ownership, build some commerce, and get something going, they were dispersed by a freeway, which then makes you go back to the start, right? Do not pass go, right? It just continued to perpetuate the gap that exists. So this is about wealth accumulation, same idea there. So connection to modern zoning. In modern zoning, what happened was we said we can't put these racial covenants on, so instead what we did was put other restrictions that created implications, right? Values of homes. If you can't afford to build this, you can't build here, right? Or you can only have one family living in this dwelling, which I think most of us know, and some of us have taken advantage of the opportunity to live with a generation above or below us, to build up some wealth, to get your opportunity to do it on your own. Well, if that's restricted and not allowed, that kind of keeps it exclusive again, even though we're not saying it out loud. So there's a lot of different restrictions we put on, and even in our enforcement today. If you think about enforcement of ordinances just as they're written today, an ordinance goes to a city council, the city council decides what they want to do. The city council, predominantly white in most communities, then sends it to their city attorney. Most cities, suburban cities, have one attorney that is their attorney. And if you're going to choose an attorney and you get one, you're going to choose the demographic that is the most influential to be your representative. So most city attorneys are white men. So with just we talked about privilege and people not always knowing, just that person then taking the direction from the city, writing an ordinance without even taking into account these other things because they're not necessarily aware, writes an ordinance that might be unfriendly or unwelcoming to certain populations. And then we move on to enforcement, same idea. So even today, the way we do things, if we don't take an intentional look at it, continues to perpetuate these same type of practices. Why covenants matter today, what we can do, they're not enforceable, right? They are distasteful. If you own a property that has one, you might not want to have it. But I think the biggest benefit from this project is just to show people it is not as simple as pull yourself up by your bootstraps. People have been put at a disadvantage for decades, for centuries. And so in order to shift, we have to make intentional choices about how we do things. So the practice of looking at these covenants, deciding to make change on these covenants, or to just say, I don't want this on my deed, it was a very expensive thing to do. So even if someone wanted to take that action, just demonstrate that action, it was a very expensive thing. So the real estate community went to the legislature and said, hey, let's take away some of these fees. Let's get rid of that cost. The counties then said, we'll do it for the cost of recording the paperwork, right? And now they're doing it for zero. At the same time, the real estate community, who also incorporates title companies, and Edina Realty Title led the way on this, started doing the paperwork side for no cost. So we're getting the word out. We're letting people know. Go ahead and take a look. If you have it there and you want to get rid of it, there are ways to get rid of it. And now the Association of Attorneys has also joined in and said, we're going to help, and we're going to start helping writing this paperwork. And so Just Deeds is a coalition between all those groups. title companies, realtors, attorneys, and the cities that are a part of them. So, and we've got a very big group and growing who are willing to do that. So, for the people who say this doesn't have an impact today, I have a personal story to share. I, as a realtor, chose to invest in property when I was early in my career for my retirement. And I bought a duplex in Robbinsdale. And this duplex was owned by two older women. Berate the children in the front yard and call the city and use the city as a stick to harass me and them. Every time there was a piece of garbage hanging out of the garbage can, or the weeds weren't quite mowed in the back alley, or whatever the case might be. And I just scratched my head. I couldn't figure the guy out. Eventually, he started to speak out loud, and he pretty much said to them and to me, if you don't stop renting to these people, I will put you out of business. And he told them that as well. And I was appalled at this person's behavior, and then I got involved in the Mapping Prejudice project. And I had the opportunity to, and if you go on the Just Deeds website, there's a lot of information here that you can follow up if you want to learn more. But one thing you can do is look at property by address. There's a link to the Mapping Prejudice website, and you can find by address. So, of course, when I was able to do that, any property that I had an interest in, or my family or anyone, I was looking those up on the website. And I pull up this duplex, and it did not have a racial covenant on it, but the entire block that it was on does. Every other house on that block, and that guy next door was an original homeowner. He thought he was well within his bounds to be doing what he was doing and calling the city and making those complaints. So when people tell me that's old news, it's unenforceable, it doesn't have an impact anymore, I share that story with them because it does. And until we start shining a light on it and making change, it's going to stay that way. People are going to continue behaving that way. Cities are going to continue to be used, unknown to them, as a tool to perpetuate these prejudices. So I appreciate all of you coming today, and I want to just open up for questions before I head out. We're going to get you a microphone before there you go.
Thanks so much, Kat. I really appreciate it. I just, before I hand this over for questions, I just wanted to say the slide you have up on health impacts. So I chair the eco-justice team here, and we've been on a journey to understand the eco-justice isn't just about the boundary waters, which I care about. It's about things like this. When you see the kind of health impacts that have been perpetuated over years, it's something we all need to pay attention to, especially those of us who have benefited long-term from the kinds of things that you're talking about. And maybe we wouldn't have chosen to benefit, but we did. And we have a lot of work to do. So.
Yeah, I didn't speak quite to that health benefit, but think about when you're figuring out where to put a dump, where are you going to put it? When you're thinking about where to dump wastewater, where are you going to put it? And so the thinking of the people who created those racial covenants carried, and so you had these communities. Right now, the communities that are the least diverse are also the communities that are affected by, get this, less green space. Less green space actually affects the temperature in those areas to the point where people's health is affected. So even the temperature from one community to another in our Twin Cities is different because of the lack of green space.
And the amount of asphalt.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be interested if you finished your story about what you were just talking about. Is there an end to it? Did this guy who was causing all the trouble, did you get to him, or did the city get to him, or
well,
or are you not willing to?
It's not a great ending. He passed away, and his son took possession of the property. So I was in there yesterday, transitioning one family of color to another family of color, and we had the conversation. because we talk about it. This guy, here's the story. You don't have to tolerate it. Here's what you can do. And I finally got the city on board and got them to understand what was happening here. And now when there's a complaint, the inspector from the city, and maybe I shouldn't say this out loud, but he'll send me a note and say, hey, get this corrected quick before I have to send out a notice. Yeah.
I wanted to share a quick story and a comment. So I just really commend your organization and also the Mapping Prejudice Project. We used the resources on the Mapping Prejudice Project to look up our own house. We're in South Minneapolis near Lake Harriet, so I was almost positive that our home had a racially restrictive covenant. And it didn't turn up yet on the Mapping Prejudice site. And when you go to the site, if you find a home that has a racially restrictive covenant, it will have a little pop-up box that will show you what the language was. So the volunteers that have done this work are amazing. And I'm so happy to know about the professional associations that are now supporting this work in their own way. So through the Mapping Prejudice Project, even though I couldn't find the language that I suspect was attached to our home, I did find a link to Hennepin County records, and so I could look at a bunch of stuff about our house. And one of the things that I found was a copy of a resolution that the county had passed, I think in 2020, formally disavowing these covenants and saying that they were going to put a copy of the resolution in the Hennepin County records of each home that was known to have had a racially restrictive covenant. So what that tells me is that my suspicion is correct. I just haven't found the documentation yet. But thanks to your presentation, I'm going to go to your site to see what additional help I can get to find that. So that's my story. My question is this. So much of what the Mapping Prejudice Project provides is opportunities for those of us who've benefited from these contracts to learn about our history, to take steps to revoke them. I'm thinking now about prospective homeowners who were previously barred from being able to purchase homes like next door to mine, for example. And I'm wondering what measures professional associations are taking to open up opportunities. For example, are there real estate fees that get waived for people who were previously excluded from owning homes in a particular? I mean, I just don't know what the options are, and if you can talk about, I guess it's kind of a reparations effort in the real estate community.
Yeah, so in the real estate community, there's a lot, and there has been a lot like me. And our PAC is the only PAC I'm aware of that actually advocates for homeowners and individuals. It's homeownership is our focus. So we have lobbyists at the federal level. We also have one individual for each member of Congress who lives in that individual's district and has a personal relationship who can say, here's what's going on, here's what we'd like done, here's some programs that would be helpful, so we can influence in that way. I play that role for Dean Phillips. It's one of the most rewarding things I do because I can meet with his team and say, you guys are considering this, and here's how that impacts our homeowners. Here's what we can do about fair housing. Here's what we can do about affordable housing, which is a huge focus for us now. And there are, created through this lobbying effort, there are many, many, many programs out there for the BIPOC community to be able to get an education, get access to funding that also includes some fees that are paid for, some grants or some secondary loans that are at no interest so that they can get in. And I'll just tell a personal story. So I worked on the board of directors at the YMCA for a while. There was a woman there named Letitia. No one in her family had ever owned a home, and I started to talk to her about it, and about 2 years later she called me and said, I think I want to try. So we got her a house. And she and her son, just a small family, and they got into a house. This year, and that was, I think, 3 years ago. This year, Letitia called me and said, I have a family issue. I need to be moving to Chicago. I need to sell my house. And I sat down with her and we figured out the house sale. And Letitia, who had come in on one of these programs, she had gotten not a grant, but a secondary loan. So she came in with, I think, $2,500 total to get in the door. Letitia moved to Chicago with a $60,000 check in her hand from her proceeds, and she was going to rent again. So she needed a little bit more education. So I sat down with her again, and I said, look at your son. He needs to see what happens here and how this works. So she bought a condo in Chicago, and she's continuing that generational wealth. So we do it one story at a time in real estate, and we really work hard on encouraging people to do that. It's very rewarding.
What a wonderful story, Kat. We're going to have to finish up at this
Sure.
point, unfortunately, but we thank you and we thank Just Deeds for the work that you do. It's been inspiring to me to find out how much you've become a leader in this, and I hope it continues to happen, and all of us in this room maybe look into our deeds. Next up, next week, Michelle Whitty, is it Whitty? Executive Director of League of Women Voters will be talking on voting rights and redistricting. And then on November 21st, the Fair Trade Gift Fair returns. So we'll have that in the Westminster Commons, and bring your shopping ideas for the year. So please join us then, and thank you all for being part of the forum this morning, and thank you, Kath.
Thank you.